Hi, welcome to this tutorial. My name is Justin Putney. This is on creating a dynamic motion preset using JSFL. And if you're not familiar with JSFL and Flash, I'm going to go through a little bit of that. And if you need more of an intro on JSFL, you can check out some of the other tutorials on this site. I also have a book coming out with famous animator Chris Georgines. The book is called Animation with Scripting for Flash Professional CS5 Studio Techniques, and we spend a chapter in that book going over JSFL and how you can use it for your animation workflow. So we're going to touch briefly on what JSFL is, how to start using it, and then move pretty quickly into some advanced techniques. Without further ado, let's get started. JSFL stands for JavaScript Flash, or Flash JavaScript. It is a language separate from ActionScript. ActionScript is the language that you use for your published Swifts, and JSFL is the language that you can use to automate the Flash authoring environment. The way you access items in JSFL is kind of similar to how you'd access them in JavaScript in your browser. You use what's called a DOM, a Document Object Model. I'm going to show you that in a moment. But first, let's look at downloading the help documents for this particular part of Flash. So if you have Flash open, you can go up to the help menu. And my menus, I apologize, are just above the recording area. I'm going to try and bring everything into the recording area instead of having them follow the mouse, which can be a little bit nauseating. So go into your community help, or you can go to the website. Go to Extending Flash Professional CS5, and then when you get there, you can say View Help PDF, and then you can click the Save button here and choose the location to save that. So I've already got that saved, so I'm just going to quit the help application. And I'm going to switch over to Acrobat, which is where I have this saved. This is the way I like to navigate it because it's a lot faster than looking at it on the web. But again, if you're looking for more introductory pieces to JSFL, this is a good place to look. And it shows you some of the basics, which we're gonna cover. And also in this version, CS5, if we keep scrolling, it'll say what's new. And you'll notice, if you're at all familiar with the motion tweens that were added in Flash CS4, they just added the functionality in CS5 to be able to manipulate those with JSFL. So that's what we're going to be looking at, these new features right here in this tutorial. So if you open up the bookmarks in this PDF, you can see what amount to, they're kind of similar to the classes in your ActionScript documentation. So we'll be looking at these to see, say, what methods are available on a frame and what properties are available on a frame. So you always want to have your help documentation available. I do a lot of scripting with JSFL, and I still don't have all of these memorized. I still rely on the help document to be my storage device. So let's go into Flash, and I'm going to create a new document. And just to show you what JSFL is kind of operating with, let's go to the history panel, which is under other panels. I'm going to undock this. So the history panel is basically an advanced undo, redo. And so if I draw something here on stage, it logs that for me. I have this right now set to display the JavaScript in the panel, but by default you might be seeing arguments. So if I use my mouse and I click on this, change that JavaScript. So you can see these are the actual JavaScript commands that will replicate these actions. So for instance, I am going to, and this is kind of undo redo, so if I were to go up to edit and say undo, it actually just slides back in the history panel. So I can redo it by sliding that down. I can select large, you can see I just create some more steps. I can select these by using the Shift key or the Control key, Command key. If I want to select one at a time, if I want to select a group, I'll use Shift. And then I can hit replay to replay a number of those steps. I can also copy those steps and I can save them directly as a command. So let me first, I'm just going to copy this rectangle and close the history panel. Again, this is just a very brief introduction. So I'm going to go up to File, New, and this time I'm going to create a Flash JavaScript file. And I'm just going to go up, paste in the code that I copied from the history panel. So if I click play, see it's created that rectangle in the same location and with the same dimensions. But let's talk just a little bit about the DOM. So in order to access the DOM, I use this function. Maybe this is a place to just start writing the first script. So what we're going to do here is take the idea of the motion preset, and let me open another document. And if you're not familiar with the motion model, let me create, again, I'll just create a rectangle to be quick about it. And I'm going to create a movie clip symbol. And so if I right click on this and say create motion tween, you should all have seen these demos by now. As opposed to an old tween, it automatically creates this as an object with a path, so I can manipulate this path. I can move the entire tween around, and then additionally there's this motion preset, so I can automatically add preset animation. I can save those. Let me just go ahead and play that. It's kind of off stage. See if I can move it. That's the nice thing about the object tweens, is that I can just move the whole tween. And there's the bounce. Okay, so those are really quick. Those are really easy to add, and they're kind of dynamic, but you can add a lot of dynamism with JSFL. So by dynamism, I mean, say for instance, I want that to bounce. I want to change how many times that bounces every time I apply it. So I apply that a lot. Sometimes I want it to bounce 3 times. Sometimes I want it to bounce 5 times. So that's the kind of thing you can script with JSFL. In this tutorial, we're gonna sort of batch an animation over a set of letters in a text field. So with that in mind, let's start writing a script to get data from that motion object. So what I want to start with a slightly simpler one. So I'm gonna, in the motion presets panel, fly in blur left looks pretty good. So I'm gonna click apply. Oops, I've got to select the object on stage. My motion presets panel, I'm gonna click apply and replace that one. So there we go, I've got that motion preset. So I'm gonna hang on to that, and let's go ahead and set up our variables. So first I need to start with this Flash object, and from that I need to get the current document. So that's this get document DOM function, okay, or method. I'll use method and function interchangeably. So let's call that DOM, and then let's also create a variable for the current timeline. The timeline sits inside the document. So that's kind of the document object model. It's a hierarchy. Document, inside the document you have timelines, inside those timelines you have layers, inside those layers you have frames, inside the frames you have objects or elements, visual things. So, and then the library is kind of its own distinct object. So let's create that timeline, and the timeline is inside the document, so I'm going to use that DOM variable and say get timeline. And then I also, let's see, for this one, I'm going to grab the current layer. I'm just going to call that L for short. Go and get it. Timeline, and I'm going to use the layers object, which is an array, and then I'm going to access the timeline again and get the current layer, which will return me an index number. So I'm basically just accessing the layers array with the current layer item, and then within that, let's use that layer object and access the array of frames within that. And let's get the current frame. Okay, so I now have access to the current frame, and what I want to do is let's just set up an alert so that we can see the output, and I'm going to access the frame, and we're going to use this new function of the frame object, this new method of the frame object, get motion object XML. So all of the motion, everything that's stored in the preset panel is XML, which is really nice because it's easy to manipulate. So we're going to get the XML from this tween that we just created, and then we'll apply that, but we'll apply it in a dynamic way. And if we wanted to, we could manipulate it as we're going through. So I'm going to use this function, get motion object XML. Be careful that it's case correct because JSFL is also case sensitive. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to save it in one level. Just save it in this file folder called progress, and I'm going to save it as, let's call this get motion XML. Okay, so make sure I have this document is my current document. I have this selected, this tweened object. I'm going to hit play and to run the script, and I should see an alert window that shows the XML. And there it is, all mushed together, but you can kind of tell that's an XML file. It's got all the data about the tween that we need to apply it. So let's alter this so it is, let's use the flash object and say clip copy string. That way it'll copy it to the clipboard. I'm going to save that. And we can run that script. And then let's create another script. So I'm going to go File, New, Flash JavaScript file. And I'm just going to jump down a couple spaces, create a variable called XML to equals, paste that in, put a colon at the end of it, and I don't really care if that wraps at all. That'll take up less space that way. And let's go grab our first two variables here. Paste them in. Now let's save this script as text animation. And I'll show you at the end of the tutorial where you can save this so that it runs as a command. So let's see. We've got those, and really now we just need to add a few more variables at the top. So let's add one for the library. Call it lib, and that's just dom.library to access that. So these are variables we're going to access throughout the script. I'm going to create one called SEL to store the first selected object. So for this script, we're just going to assume that only one object is selected, but for a more advanced script, you could obviously check all of the selected items and validate them. So in this case, dom.selection is an array, and I'm just going to use array notation to get the first item with a 0. So let's set up. Well, let's go through a couple of basic items first. So, like I said, we're going to animate all the characters in the text field. So let's just start with this. I'm just gonna. Oh, there's the commands directory, just popped up automatically. I'm going to save this as test file. And I'm going to grab the text tool and create a text field. Let me move the properties panel over here so you can see some of this. So I'm just going to say this is text and my selection tool. Now in CS5, TLF text layout format is native, so there's all kinds of cool styling that you can use. And then there's classic text, which is the good old text that we know and love. But let's make sure, before we do anything else, that we can recognize both of those. So I'm going to close this get motion XML file, get it out of the way since we've already got the XML for that motion. And you know what, I'm going to go ahead and close and not save that just to clean it up. So let me flip back to the help doc here, and let's look at element, which is the most basic item, most basic stage item. And here's a good sense of the hierarchy here to access an element, the document object model. So what I'm looking for is actually this element type variable. So, and some of this is, well, not exactly out of date, but not quite updated because some of these features haven't been added. So there's a lot of, you can't really manipulate TLF quite yet. If you want to do that, you just put in a request to Adobe, but right now we have this. So let's check the element type and make sure that we can distinguish a TLF text item and a regular text box, and make sure that we can be sure that we're just manipulating those. So I'm going to take the cell variable, the selection, and check the element type with an alert box. So I'm going to go over here, make sure that I've got the text field selected in my document, and I'm just going to hit play, and it tells me it's TLF text. Okay, that's good. Let me do that again. Let's remember the capitalization. So lowercase TLF, capital T text. And now let me switch this to a classic text field. Get on one line and hit play and just make sure, yes, it is indeed text. So let's change this to an if statement, and we'll say if element type is equal to text, or element type is equal to TLF text. Okay, so then if either of those are the case, then let's run our function. In these scripts, it's not always necessary to put things in functions, but I like to do that because it's a good way to instantly break the process if you need to. So if you find that something is missing, you can immediately jump out of a function and stop the script, and it reduces the likelihood of error. So let's create this function called run, and I'm just saving periodically here. So let's set up a system, keeping in mind that as we create this, I should demonstrate one other thing here. Either if this is classic text or static text, we're going to be relying on breaking it apart. So if I go to modify and say break apart, This breaks classic text into individual characters. I'm going to undo, switch it to TLF text. If I say modify, break apart, it breaks it into shapes, which is fine. All we need to do is we're going to make each one of those into symbols, and we're going to animate each one individually. So, in fact, thinking ahead, I'm going to bring up the timeline a little bit so you can see that. So I'm going to undo that. So we got our text field. So, so since we're going to break each of those characters apart and make each one a movie clip, it's going to have its own layer. Let's think about organizing it from the get-go. So I'm going to create a couple variables here. First, I'm going to create a prefix, and we'll just call that text, maybe like text animation, and an underscore. And then I'm going to create a variable called iteration, not set it to anything. Variable called iteration. Yeah, let's see if I can spell iteration data name. And let's set that to text animation. And that should be good for right now. So what we're going to do with that is name each one of our layers, name our symbols. We're also going to create a layer folder to store all the layers that'll be named, and a library folder to store all of the individual symbols. So, with that in mind, maybe we can even get those out of the way first. So let's create two additional functions down here at the bottom. Call the first one get iteration num. And this is actually a really advanced technique. It's not difficult, it's just not something that you run into a lot. So I'm creating a second one called set iteration num, and that's going to accept one parameter. And so inside this get iteration, actually let's start with set. We're going to access that DOM variable, and you can actually add persistent data to a document. So just the way Flash stores, say, the number of layers, like you create a new layer after layer 1, it calls it layer 2. And suppose you do a whole bunch of things and you rename layer 2. When you create the next layer, it still calls the next layer layer 3. It's keeping track of those, so it doesn't automatically create two layer 2s. So you can do the same thing, just using this add data to document. So we're going to use that iteration data name. You can see I'm getting the code hinting here too for JSFL, which is nice. And I'm going to set that to type integer, because that's just going to be a simple number that we're going to store and iterate. So then let's set that unset iteration value to that number as well. And then get iteration, we're going to get the new number by using the reverse function dom.get data from document, and we'll use the iteration data name, and then we're going to add one to that document, or sorry, to that integer, and if it happens to be undefined, I'm going to use a 0 in its place. So this is one half of that. I think it's called the bitwise OR operator, or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's half of the logical OR. Right above it's the shift on the forward slash. So then, still within that function, so anytime you retrieve it, you're going to essentially update it. You set iteration num. Correct my spelling there. Iteration num, and we're going to set that to that new num just created, and then we're going to return that new num. Okay, so you won't ever have to access this set iteration num directly. You'll just get the new iteration number and it'll automatically set the appropriate one. Okay, so in this run function now, let's create a new var. Let's call it it_name for iteration name. We'll use the prefix plus get iteration num, and we don't have to pass anything to that. And then let's make sure that since we're only looking at the first element in the selection, let's make sure that's the only element. So we're going to set that dom.selection value, and remember that's an array, so we have to use the brackets, and we just want it to be a single item array with that selection, which we know is either a regular text field or a TLF text field. So then, just like I showed you on stage, we're going to use the break apart function of the document to break that into pieces. And actually, if you want to, you can just make sure you have that selected. We can go ahead and test this step, and that looks just fine. So I'm just going to undo. I might actually do a couple of undos so that it undoes the this get iteration num. Okay, so, but that's not important just yet. I'll come back to that. So now let's get the broken apart letters, and I'm just going to call those pieces because theoretically they don't actually even have to be letters, but for the sake of this they are. So we're going to get that from the current selection that was just broken apart. And now let's create the new layer folder that's going to store all of these items. So that's going to be, actually I'll just start from here to access the timeline. Use add new layer. Again, if you ever want to know how to get a function, so if for instance I'm looking for something on the timeline, which is a little bit down below, it's in here but it's down below timeline, click on that. It'll be in here, add new layer. You can click on that and see the arguments that it accepts, and again, anything in brackets means it's optional. So technically we don't even need a layer name, but we are definitely going to give this a layer name, and we're going to keep track of it. Add new layer. Getting a little ahead of myself. We'll use that it_name variable, and we definitely want it to be type folder. Okay, and then if you look at the documentation here, you look at what it returns an integer value of the newly added layer. So we want that integer value, so we're going to create a variable called folder index. Alright, and that will store that so we can access it later. And then let's also create a library folder, and that will have the same name. Okay, we're getting ready for our loop now. So let's just to jump ahead, since I know what's happening here, I'm going to create a position variable, because through a bit of trial and error I figured out that when you break these apart you actually get them in reverse. So we're going to write the loop so it goes backwards through the pieces. So for instance, in this text field, this T at the end is going to be the first one, and then the X, and so on. So I'm going to create this position variable that starts from 0 that I can then access things in a forward direction, which you'll see in a moment. I'm going to create also a current frame variable that I can use to reset the frame as we add them later, so that we can come back and grab our artwork as we're updating things. So let's create a for loop, and I'm going to set the I value to pieces dot length -1. So again, we're going to loop through this array backwards, and then we want I to be greater than or equal to 0, so that it stops when it hits the first item in the array. And then we're, instead of doing I++, it's I minus, and create the brackets for that. Okay, now inside there, we're going to create a variable to store the current piece that we're looking at. Use array access notation in there, call it elem, and for element. Okay, and now let's go ahead and clear the selection. So we can use dom.select none and add the parentheses to call a function, and then dom.selection, and let's set that equal to elem. Okay, and then let's create a name for our element, elem name, and it's going to be it name, and then let's concatenate an underscore, and we'll use that position variable, which at the bottom, we can go ahead and write that now. Position is going to be ++, so it's going to be incremented each time we go through the loop. So we've got that. We've got one piece selected at a time now. Let's convert it to a symbol. So we're going to use dom convert to symbol, and we're going to make this a movie clip. Again, you can find the particulars of what needs to go here in the documentation. So I'm going to give it a name matching this elem name here, and set the registration point to top left. It's not really important in this case, but it may be in the animation that you're making, so keep that in mind. And then once that's made into a symbol, it's still going to be selected. So we're actually just going to cut it with this clip cut function. And then we're going to create a new layer for it and store that index. So I'm just going to call that I layer num, because I like to call things I in these loops because they're getting iterated. They're just temporary variables. So I'm going to access that timeline variable again, say add new layer, and we're going to give it a let's just give it the elem name, and actually after we convert it to a symbol, let's just go ahead and move it to folder in the library. It's going to be it name, elem name. Okay, so this item to move is optional. We're going to reference it with the element name, and you'll remember that up here we created a new folder in the library and gave it this name. So we're going to take this item, move it to this folder. Okay, so we've got a layer created, we've got the index for that layer, and we're going to then paste that layer with clip paste, and we want it to be in place, so we're going to pass a value of true. And then let's see, I'm just checking through so we don't add any complexity prematurely here. Okay, so then let's also, one more thing we can do before making a preview here is let's create a variable to store that layer, because we're actually going to access it a little bit. So timeline, again we'll get the layers array, and we'll use that I layer num index, and then we're going to use I layer, and we can take that layer and move it underneath the folder by setting its parent layer variable. So we're going to access timeline.layers and then use the folder index array. So that'll move it underneath that folder. So let's go ahead and make sure we've got that text field selected. And I'm going to run the script. And there's a slight delay as it runs. And then you should see everything has been removed from this original layer, and it's all placed on its own layers in order. I can click on them. There we go. And it's in a folder, so it's nice and organized. So then what we're going to just do is animate each one of these keyframes. See, they're all nice and organized in the library here too. So I'm just going to hold Command Z till we get back to our text field here. And I'm going to delete what's in the library now. Okay. So we've got our text field. And so, one thing we're going to do as we start adding frames, this is going to get more complex, so we want to jump back to this current frame. So, up at the top of the loop, I'm going to say timeline, set selected frames, set that to current frame, and then it's going to extend one frame, so it's going to say current frame plus 1, and I'm going to say true to replace whatever selection is already there. Okay, and now we're going to be adding frames as we go through. So after we cut this, okay, right before we paste it. So when we add a new layer, that layer is automatically going to be selected. We want to add a keyframe. So we're going to say timeline. We're just going to make sure it's a blank keyframe. So we're going to say insert blank keyframe. And I know it's right when it highlights. It's kind of a tough one. And I'm going to create a value called StartFrame. And I don't want it to add a keyframe if I happen to be on the first frame. So I'm going to say, I'm going to indent this and put this in an if statement. If StartFrame is not equal to 1, then go ahead and add a keyframe. I'm going to close that bracket off. Saving as I go. Okay, so now I've created that keyframe, and I will of course have to determine my start frame in a moment. And so after, let's go ahead and just put in some other good stuff here. I'm going to create an iframe just like my I layer, so it's going to be I layer, access the frames array in there, and access that start frame value, which is going to be, in this case, it's going to be, frame 1, or as JSFL sees it, it's frame 0 because it's an array. It starts at 0. So, we're gonna go back and we're gonna position it based on however many frames each letter is animated. So now that we've got this frame variable, we can write the motion object function. So we can say iframe set motion object XML. Remember, all these functions are on there. We're going to use this XML we grabbed from the motion tween. We're going to grab that and put that in there, and we're going to say true, which if you look in the documentation, I go to frame This is really how I do it every time I have to jump back to the documentation to make sure I've got everything right. So I'm looking for set motion object XML. So this variable says end at the current location, which is exactly what I want. I want the text to ultimately look the way it started on screen. I don't want it animating and staying off in other directions. I want it to start somewhere else and end as it looks now. So I'm going to set that optional parameter to true. And then I can also use this set motion object duration to adjust this. And up above I'm going to create a total duration variable, and I'm going to subtract the start frame where the tween starts. So all of them are going to say, end at like frame 40, and each one takes up a certain number of frames, but I want all of them to stop there. And then there's this nice argument that you can pass here, stretch existing frames. We're going to set that to false, because if we stretched all of them, then essentially the ones that take up a lot of space on the timeline are going to be really slow. We want each letter to come in and stop, and so they're going to kind of bam, 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 bam. So we're going to say false, and so when it extends that, it's not going to stretch out the animations and make them slower. We've got all that. Now we have to go up and set this. We have to set this start frame variable, and we have to set the total duration. Okay, so let's go up above the loop after position, and let's create this total duration. But before we do that, let's roll with, in order to make this flexible, let's roll with whatever is in the XML. So the duration in there right now is 15 seconds, but it shows it in, it's not milliseconds. I think that's actually milliseconds, yeah. So you see 15,000 instead of 15, and the timescale is 24,000, meaning this was captured from a document that had a 24 frames per second frame rate. So let's grab that information, so then you could theoretically at any point, or using user interaction, you could change what tween goes in there, and the script will respond to that. So let's create an anim duration for each animated piece, create that variable, and we're just going to access the XML and that duration attribute. We're going to divide that by the value in the timescale. So we're essentially dividing, a 15 frame animation by 24 frames per second in order to get the whatever fraction of a second, or the number of seconds that this animation takes place. So then we'll multiply that by the frame rate of the current document using that frame rate property. And let's just take the whole thing and make sure to round it so that it's actually readable as a frame value. And then from that, we can create the total duration variable, and by taking that anim duration and multiplying it by the number of pieces, number of items that'll be animated. So now we can go down and let's find a good place for this, right under element. Let's create the start frame, and we're going to round this one down. It's math.floor, and say anim duration times that position value. So that's going to be incremented as we loop through each letter. And then in a moment, we're going to make that a little more advanced. So, unless I'm forgetting something, and we'll find out really quickly if I am, this should very quickly turn into a series of animated characters with that fly-in. Okay. We've got a JavaScript error, and it didn't tell us anything, so that's not very helpful. I'm going to undo these items until I get back to my text field. I have to create a motion object first, don't I? Maybe that's what I've left out. That is indeed what I left out. So why don't I go ahead and create a motion object? There's always something. So, of course, this has to be a motion object first, and I should mention, of these great new features that are added, you can check to see if something is a motion object before you say try and apply motion object XML to it. So in this case, it's just an omission, but it's good to see that when you have an error with this XML file, it gives you absolutely no information. So it's good to get as much of the code down before you get to that point, so that it'll be easier to diagnose. So I'm going to say create motion object, and then I'm going to uncomment these frames, check and make sure the text file is in place, and just to simplify things, I might just make this shorter. And make sure I've got it selected there. Okay. I set start frame to 1, but of course, since it's looking at the frames as an array, the first one is going to be 0. We are going to set this motion object. We're going to set it so that it ends at that current location. And we're going to set the object duration basically so that each one ends in the same place by taking that total duration and subtracting where the tween is starting from. Alright, so now let me hit play, and hopefully everything will work there. Okay, now we've got 4 text characters, and they come in, and there it is, it's working. But already I can see I want to start making adjustments, so again I'm going to undo, just holding Command Z on the Mac here until I get back to the text field. I'm going to make some adjustments. First of all, I know I want this to be a lot shorter duration, so instead of 15,000 milliseconds, let's just make that 6. And let's also add something so that they can kind of overlap. So I'm going to add what I will call a delay %. So this will be the percentage that these overlap. So if I scroll down now to start frame, I'm going to manipulate the start frame, add another paren there. I'm going to multiply it times this delay %. So in essence then, since this is 0.5, it's going to chop each one of these in half so that half of the animation of this E is going to overlap this T. That way the T isn't going to come in and stop, and then the E starts. They're all going to be overlaying each other. So that should be all we need to accomplish that. So got that in place. I'm going to go ahead and hit play. You can see the timelines are overlapping now, and they're lots shorter, so I'm going to preview that by clicking the return key or the enter key, and that's a lot nicer effect. What you have here now is something with tremendous power, and there are all kinds of ways to add additional power. Let me just show some examples. Now, obviously, there's any number of tweaks that you can do to this. Let's save this as a command. This is actually in the documentation. If I go back up to the introduction, I'm going to scroll down real quickly. And here it shows you the common locations. There's a really good way to find this. If you this temporary script, type fl.trace And then, and by the way, helpful little tip when you're debugging, JSFL trace doesn't clear every time you run the way it does an action script when you do trace. So in order to empty that panel, you can put this at the top of your script, fl.actionspanel.clear, and that'll clear out. So right now in the output panel we have this leftover stuff. So I'm going to clear that out and then trace this new item, and I'm just going to get the config directory, config URI, either one works, and I'm going to hit play. Oops, sorry, not actions panel. That started typing for me. Output panel. There we go. Output panel.clear. And click play. Okay. So this is telling me where to find it. I need to basically find this configuration folder. It's going to be in a language region folder. Flash CS5. Make sure it's the right one for the version. So you have a separate one for Flash CS4, Flash CS3, etc. So if you locate that, and what I usually do is put a shortcut on my desktop. So I'm going to take this script, this text animation script, and on my desktop I have you can see I've got them for a couple different versions, and inside the configuration folder there is a commands directory. So these are all my commands. So I'm going to say text animate characters. You can call it whatever you want. You can make a whole bunch of different versions of this with different animations. So if I now create a new document, and just grab a text field, hello there, and I'm just going to switch to the timeline so you can see what's going on. I'm going to go to commands right above the capture area there and say text animate characters. And I've got a JavaScript error. But rather than spending any time debugging that, you get the idea of you can just run it from your commands panel. So you can save it as a command. You can then distribute that command. You can also add user feedback. So I'm going to quickly show, you've seen the alert panel. I'm going to show you a number of other things here you can do. So let's create a prompt, which is there's in between, actually before I get to prompt there's a confirm. So I'm going to create a new variable called result, and that'll be traced, and I'm going to call this confirm function and say, we'll say are you sure? And now when I run this script, you can see I get a confirm. It's got OK or cancel. If I click OK, get a result of true back. Run this again, click cancel, get a result of false. So you can use that in this script. You can use it in any other script. If you happen to get false, you could jump out of this function by typing return. And then even beyond that, confirm there's prompt. Okay. So suppose you wanted to give them a chance to name the animation. And if I type that in, or just suppose I hit cancel, get null. Play, call this text animation fast or something, and I click OK. So it gives me text animation fast. So I can use that to name the folder, name the layers. I could also say, get like the duration of the animation, so it could set that on the fly. And then even beyond that, if you take a quick look at, go all the way down here, there's an XML UI panel, which allows you to create XML files that can create advanced dialog boxes. And I'll just show you a quick preview of one of those, if I have one in here. So this combined text fields, I actually have to make a text field. So let's make one in here. Create a new layer. Hello again. And I actually have to make this because, like I said before, TLF can't be accessed with JSFL right now. This is an older. I must have multiple text fields selected. It's been so long I forgot what this even did. Okay, it combines multiple text fields, so make multiple text fields. So here's an example of an advanced dialog. I've got radio buttons. I've got this entry field. You can also have drop-down menus. So you can imagine that if you write this script, this animation script, smart enough, you could create any number of animations that change based on the particular situation. And then you can really easily distribute those by creating an extension. And if you want to read about that, you can look at the chapter 4, workflow automation, in the Studio Techniques book that is coming out that I mentioned at the beginning of this tutorial. There's also a really good book called Extending, I think at the time it was Macromedia Flash MX 2004. That's by, I think it's Todd Yard and Keith Peters, if I got it right. If I don't, I apologize. But that's basically the book on JSFL. It even contains some of the stuff that isn't in the documentation, especially about the XML UI panel. Beyond that, you're only limited by your imagination. If you saw some of the previews for CS5, like at Max 2009, Tony D from the Flash team created a physics panel. So you can create, if you look at the book or you look at Go To and Learn, Lee Brimlow shows how to make Swift panels. But I'll show you, this is a custom-made Swift panel that I created that holds all these kind of macros, these basic functions. And what Tony D did was create one of these panels that was a physics panel. So you could select a whole bunch of things, click a button, and it would add gravity. Things would fall as if they were in a pinball game. So all this is made possible by these functions that you're using in this tutorial of the frame object, these motion object functions. So a little bit of math, a little bit of creativity, see what you can come up with. Thanks for listening.